Today we're embarking on a careful study of the 1955 reform. Father Palko explains what changed, why it changed, and whether these revisions were justified or dangerous. From Palm Sunday to the Easter Vigil, we explore the reasons behind the time shifts, structure changes, and liturgical simplifications. Were these revisions paving the way for the Novus Ordo? Or were they well-intentioned efforts to help the faithful participate more fully? We also examine the SSPX's actual practice today, and whether using the later rites is a compromise, a prudential choice, or a litmus test for tradition. On sspxpodcast.com/mass, you'll be able to find all of these episodes, videos, and resources. This is free to listen to, but please do consider a one-time or a small monthly recurring donation. And please consider leaving a rating and a review on the podcast. This helps others find these episodes and discover the beauty and the truth of traditional Catholicism. So now let's join Father Palko for number 46 of the Catholic Mass series, the 1955 Holy Week Reform in Context. Father Palko, round two. You ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. We are, welcome back to the Mass series. We are doing the second part of this episode that we started last week, which is why the SSPX uses the certain year missal, the 1962 that the SSPX does, and also more bluntly to this week's question, why does the SSPX use the Holy Week that the SSPX uses? So just a quick recap in case someone hasn't seen last week's episode already, Father, what did we discover and what did we look at last week, kind of from a 30,000 foot view?
Sure. I think it's important. I would recommend, in fact, watching that one before you get into this one, because a lot of the same principles will apply, and we flesh them out a lot more there than we really can here.
Okay.
But we did discuss the 1962 Missal and why the Society uses it. We said, well, we can't accept the Novus Ordo Missal, in the Missal of 1969, because it's not a, we could say, specifically Catholic rite. It's amorphous, ambiguous. It's intentionally removed and modified the liturgy to eliminate explicitly Catholic truth, Catholic elements. Cardinal Tapiati said as much. So it's not us who are trying to come up with this idea. One of the Church's greatest theologians from the 20th century and the prefect of the Holy Office said as much. So it ends up becoming more or less a danger to the faith by omission. And it's a danger that really begins to undermine the priesthood and the sacrificial nature of the Mass and the real presence in the Eucharist. And it's not that we don't think the Pope can change a liturgy. In fact, we went through examples of where the liturgy changed quite a bit, in fact. Rather, it's that there are certain bounds in which the Church is restricted, very much like the infallibility question of the Pope. There's only certain things that the Pope can do, and he's limited on those things. And the power that he has, even to change the liturgy, it has those certain bounds. It was exceeded in the Novus Ordo. And so we go back to the last official edition that was certainly clearly promulgated by the Church that doesn't have any issues against the faith. And that was the principle. If there was an issue with the faith, we could disobey because the faith is higher than obedience, which is a part of justice. And in fact, that's what we're doing. We're going with the last one that's possible, even if perhaps we may have personal preferences other ways.
Okay. Let's look at the Holy Week liturgy, the various Holy Week liturgies. You had mentioned last week, kind of in brief, that you, if it were, and I'm maybe misquoting you, if it were up to you, you would celebrate the pre-1955 Holy Week. You're a fan of it personally.
I would say this way. There are certain things that I think on a personal level, my own opinion, certainly needed to be changed. They were well in need of change. And even St. Pius X was recognizing this. It was a long-standing thought that certain changes, especially to the times, needed to be changed. And that would happen in a general liturgical reform. And I would, because I think that more was thrown out and changed than really needed to be to achieve the goals of a good liturgical reform. I would probably, if it were up to me, I think I would tend towards the celebration of those, if it, again, up to me. But as we saw last time, and my whole principle was, it's not up to me. I am, as a priest, bound to what the Church wants me to do. I am to be formed by the liturgy, not to form the liturgy according to my own whims. And So I think, and maybe that's one of the reasons I sort of volunteered for this episode, is I figured that it's such a hot topic, the Holy Week rites.
Yeah.
We're doing it on one of the hottest days of the year too. So hot topic for a hot day.
Yeah.
But it's such a hot topic that I think you want somebody who's really not going to try to be an apologist for either side of these things. I obviously have my preference. I'm stating it to begin with because, well, the best way of understanding where a bias might be and to overcome that is to see where we're at on those things. And so in this podcast and what we're going to try to present, I'm not going to argue that somehow that came before 1956 was so problematic that there was some necessary change that had to happen to the degree to which it did. I will be able to be a little critical of those changes. But at the same point in time, I'm also not going to argue that every change was bad or evil in all of its parts. And I'm certainly not going to argue that on our own authority, we can go back and we can decide to do something that the church seemingly legitimately changed.
Okay.
So I guess what I could say is what I'm going to try to communicate in this podcast is that the older is objectively better on most points, but it did have some practical issues that needed to be addressed to allow the faithful to better understand and participate in the Holy Week rites. And especially the change in the times was important. In the older rite, everything was done in the morning, including the Paschal Vigil. Mm-hmm. On Saturday, you'd end by noon, and it's already Easter at noon on Holy Saturday when Good Friday just ended 12 hours beforehand, which seems to not really jive with the whole liturgical spirit that should be there. And there are reasons that happened. But at the same point in time, even if the older is, I guess you could say, objectively better, as I put it, until the church herself deals with this problem, I don't think we have a legitimate claim to go back to everything beforehand sui juris of our own accord. If the church grants an indult to do that, great. If the superiors decide that that's what's going to be done, great. But each individual priest shouldn't just decide that that's what they want to do, and therefore we're going to do that. And in doing all of these things, I think it's important that we try as best as we can to sort of steel man the argument from somebody else and not straw man it. Mm-hmm. And that's what I'd like to do here. I probably will fail in some ways of doing that, but I think that some of the lack of, or when we take one position or the other on these things, we tend to just sort of, straw man the argument. As we mentioned before, Father Bonini was involved, and therefore, well, maybe not. Let's look at that and let's try to make the best case for the opposing side, and then make the case for our side against that. It's what St. Thomas Aquinas was constantly doing in his Summa, right? He's coming up with better arguments against what he's going to try to say, and not just weak arguments that he's going to try to attack.
Right. I really appreciate that. I really appreciate trying to give the benefit of the doubt to the reformers, to these changes. And some may be shocked to hear me say that, because we're used to demonizing those who have destroyed the liturgy, right? Who have reformed the liturgy to such an extent. I think it's important, though. I'm a fan of watching bike racing. The Tour de France was just wrapping up over the last few weeks, a big bike race. And there's these two competitors, and I promise it's not too much of a tangent, but there's these two competitors who the last few years have really been fighting against each other. And one of them had an accident and fell. And the other guy, his competitor, who was at the front of the pack, actually slowed down the whole pack to give his competitor, who had fallen, not his fault, to give him a chance to catch back up again. There's that sportsmanship of, I want to beat this guy, but I want to beat him
fairly and without the asterisks, right?
Right, exactly. And I think it's really important for us to do the same thing on something so important as this, because if we're just going, well, that was just Bonini, so everything gone. No, that's not that. That's a bad argument.
Right. And I think we'll see that it ends up being a really bad argument, especially for Holy Week. We'll certainly get into that. I don't want to jump the gun on that, but sure. No, I think especially when it comes to such controversial subjects. I mean, and Holy Week's an interesting thing too. I will freely admit, I kind of like the older, and I see the
Right.
symbolism. And I grew up.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't grow up with it, but when I first came over to tradition, there was an independent priest who was using it, so I'm familiar with it in its celebration, and not to the extent some other people are, and people who probably have written great things on it. I'll mention a gentleman here that I know, and in my notes I put a little later, Gregory de Pipo,
Yeah.
who writes for New Liturgical Movement.
Yep.
He has some absolutely excellent scholarship on these things. I think if I'm going to criticize him in some way when he's talked about these things, he doesn't steel man the other side. It's very good research, but I think he oftentimes defaults to the idea and the assumption that the reformers they were trying to do something that really wasn't supported by history, and then they tried to sort of shoehorn history into it.
Sure.
Yeah, to an extent, I think some did. Some may just have had bad historical, research too. We want to give the benefit of the doubt. At the same point in time, we can say that, maybe that change was wrong or imprudent or something like that. But we're never going to have a constructive argument and really actually go somewhere. And maybe in the future, when the church is sane enough again to be able to decide this question on what do we do, to come up with something that is an organic development from what was there, that changes the things that needs to be changed, that restores the things that need to be restored. And we're only going to be, again, demonizing, like you said, the other side if we're not careful about this.
Yeah. And spoiler, once that does happen, because I have faith it will, it's not going to happen during our lifetimes. So let's not be too hasty. All right. So let's keep going on kind of the intro part of this. We talked about this a bit last week, but you said, that the pre-56, pre-55 Holy Week, like, you like it. There are things that are better about it. There are things that are objectively better about it. So why not use it? Why not just act sui juris? Why not act of your own accord and just do it?
Well, in the end, again, like I said before, the spirit of the church really is, in as far as regards to liturgy, it's a public prayer. And even if for good reasons, the crowd that says restore the 54 dates, you could argue it. The changes happened in 51 for the vigil, and then in 55, late 55 after Holy Week so it's sort of the 56, 55, but who's counting at that point in time? There's good reasons. I think we could come up with really good reasons to lament certain changes. And again, steel mailing here. But to follow one's preferences really is the liturgical spirit of the Novus Ordo, which allows so many liturgical abuses, right? Without standing in there. The rubrics don't prevent this, so I can do whatever I feel like, or they do, but my bishop's not going to argue with me. I don't think that's a good sort of. I don't think that's a good foot to be stepping out onto. It's not a stable ground when we can just do whatever we feel like. And it's especially not the stable ground when we get to decide of our own accord that a certain thing is good or bad, and we must or must not do that. There has to be a degree of responsibility to a hierarchy in some way. Otherwise, we're really just acting ourselves. We're not acting in the spirit of a church. We're kind of going towards that Protestant individualistic spirit, even if we keep Catholic doctrines on certain things. And so I would argue that those who decide to implement the Old Holy Week of their own accord and do so without permission disobey authority for their personal preferences. It's one thing to make an argument that there's an aspect of the faith in danger, and that was the argument of Archbishop Lefebvre as to why we use the 62 and not the Novus Ordo. There's an issue of the faith, and there's not an issue of the faith in the changes that lead up to 62. Right. Same thing here, though. I don't think we would argue that there is an aspect of the faith which is touched on, except maybe on a point or two here or there, and it's only a sort of a distant point. But you'll get people who, in order to show their sort of traditional, their card-carrying traditionalists take up this issue as if, well, I'm going to be more traditional than the others. But in doing that, they're really not being traditionally minded to the spirit of the church and how her liturgy has developed, in fact, and how the church has regulated it.
Sure.
Not to be overly critical, so I'm society priest, I might be a little critical of the position of the fraternity. Not here, but back in 2018, they received a 3-year permission from the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith to use the pre-56 ceremonies. And in a lot of places they did. Some places they didn't. It was a 3-year experimental permission, and it ended in 2020 without it being extended. So there's no longer an official permission for it. There's also no longer a Ecclesiae Dei commission. Some might argue that point.
Sure.
But it's not 3 years. It's more than 3 years afterward. And that's not long enough to establish some kind of custom here either. But I know that there are a lot of fraternity priests, and I know there are a lot of other priests who, based off of this idea, haven't stopped using those earlier rites, and even sometimes modifying them to their own desires, and even adding where permission was given but it wasn't used, and now adding that when they've moved to a new parish or something like that, even against the will of some of their bishops. And also, that permission came with the obligation to use the new prayer for the Jews that Benedict XVI promulgated. But a lot of places didn't do that. Right. So, again, I can appreciate the desire to go back, and I can appreciate the love for those ceremonies and the symbolism, the various other things that's there. But we don't want to be like the liturgical abuse crowd at the Novus Ordo and just do what we feel like and take liberties on these kinds of things. We don't get a pass just because we say traditional, just because we say the faith. And those things confuse the faithful a lot. That's why, in fact, I think this is such a hot button issue, is that you have people going out there and trying to do these things, and then it sets these two things against each other as if there's some kind of litmus test for traditionalism over how you answer this kind of question.
Yeah. I think that's a really important point that I just want to clarify with you, make sure I'm understanding it correctly before we move forward. And that is, to make a change or to ignore a change or to ignore a directive. So you were talking about the fraternity here, not receiving permission to continue on. They may claim, well, but it's good for the faith that we continue doing the previous. Well, now the onus is, if you make that claim, you independent priest, fraternity priest, SSPX priest, whomever, if you make that claim that, hey, the pre-55 Holy Week, that is better for the faith, the onus is on you. You got to show me why, and is that is keeping the pre-55 Holy Week important enough to be disobedient to what the hierarchy is telling you to do? And your position is, yeah, there may be a couple little things here and there, but on the whole, it is not more of a danger to the faith than using the later Holy Week. Therefore, it is a bad thing to ignore this.
Right, and I think it sets a bad precedent. It more or less it sells the farm to save the horse, right?
Yeah.
Some people might argue, and I've read some of these things about it, that comparing it like I have here to the liturgical abuse, type thing in the Novus Ordo, is a false parallel. I mean, even we in the society, as we'll discuss, don't 100% follow what you'll find in the 1962 Missal for Holy Week. We actually do follow what you'll find in the Ordo Hebdomadae Sancti Instauratus, which is the official book that was put out in 1956. We follow that almost to a T. And there are some conflicts and things that were changed, minor changes here and there. So fair enough. But I think we do follow the rubrics, and those things that aren't exactly 100% on are actually what we talked about before, praeter legem variations, things that stand outside the rubrics, don't conflict with them, and are retaining a practice that was beforehand that are not forbidden. And even you're allowed to change these things, as we'll see. But even if that were true, even if we're kind of, being hypocritical by on one hand claiming that, no, you have to obey, and then, well, you don't obey in this here, that doesn't justify others being disobedient. If I am being a hypocrite and saying this or doing that, that's not the way you should do. Yeah, call me out for it. Fair enough. But don't then say, well, I get to do whatever I feel like. It doesn't solve the problem, just doing as we please. It certainly doesn't solve the problem of tradition in doing what we please.
So good discussion. Great topic to talk about. I mean, we're doing it today, but there's a few principles that I think we need to follow as we continue on. And what are those, Father?
Well, firstly, I think we need to admit, and I hope that those who object to the changes would be willing to admit this, none of the changes actually cause some contradiction or reduction of the Catholic faith or morals. Obviously, morals doesn't really enter into it, but it doesn't call into question, say, as with the Novus Ordo, the priesthood, the ordained priesthood in its role, the sacrifice of the Mass, the real presence. None of those things actually move the needle that direction towards a denial or a reduction of something that's certainly Catholic. So if we can admit that, then we can say these variations may actually be imprudent or prudent, but that's the decision of the authority. And, well, it was Pius XII who approved these things, knowing what it contained. Some might argue he was getting sick towards the end of these things and maybe didn't have a full competency over the changes, but he certainly was in his good, mind and everything like that when he desired and read and approved and enjoyed and celebrated the experimental vigil that was done in 1951.
Right.
So, and in fact, many of the changes are actually tied to different rubrical instructions. So if we're going to restore anything, if this discussion leads to people thinking we do need to restore something, we have to take into account certain rubrical simplifications and reconcile those things, reconcile the changing of times with what we would like to restore. And I think that's all a fine academic discussion.
Yeah.
But the Bark of Peter has a bunch of holes in it, and maybe deck chair placement is not what we should be arguing about until we've patched those holes, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's like you said, matter of priorities.
Mm-hmm.
Can we revisit real quick something we talked about last week, but has relevance here? The church is allowed to change the liturgy. I think we need, especially as traditional Catholics, we need to wave that banner long and strong and proud and say, the church can change the liturgy. We're not saying that it has to be static.
Right. But it's, again, like I said before, within certain legitimate bounds.
Right.
Normally, it would take a very long process. It wasn't a committee who got together and designed a rite. It was hundreds of years for certain little things to change. But there are plenty of changes. What happened with Quo Primum in 1570 is more or less a centralization of those changes, rather than each diocese, each religious order, each place, each country kind of doing their own thing and modifying the rite. As because of Protestantism, we can't allow that to be a risk. So what we want to do now is centralize everything. And effectively, that's what St. Pius V did with the missal he gave us. And without needing to revisit the whole discussion, St. Pius X himself is one of the ones who is no modernist, of course. I mean, condemns modernism, and yet saw fit to make certain changes to the liturgy somewhat dramatic. Remember back when we talked about sacred music and even participation in the liturgy, we mentioned Cardinal Sarto, Pius X's votum. This was a document, a fairly long document that he gave to the Congregation for Rites about liturgical reform and in particular sacred music. Much of that turned into the encyclical or the motu proprio Tra la Solitudine, which we talked about in the sacred music episode. But he does discuss the liturgy change in general. And he says something really interesting here, a little bit of a long quote. But he says, the Holy See has the undeniable right to look after everything which concerns the sacred liturgy. She can modify it or introduce new things into it which were never used before. Or she can find a good substitute for the old ones that have been suppressed or lost. However, the Holy See does not approve anything which is clearly contrary to the traditions of the liturgy. Moreover, she condemns, even by name, all the abuses and unfitting novelties which are introduced now and then in one or another parts of the sacred liturgy. Now, I don't think Pius X really could have foreseen that his own successor, Paul VI, would approve the Novus Ordo. Mm-hmm. Clearly contrary to the traditions of the church. And he's not saying there that a pope couldn't do something corrupt like that, but rather when acting in a normal and sane manner, the church is bound to approve only what is not contrary to tradition and condemn what's unfitting, even if she does introduce new things or substitute old things. Again, so there's this bound here. And again, the votum's only really speaking about sacred music, but the principle is sound. With the church, the Holy See can't approve things, or should not, or must not, without violating its prudence, certainly, and its own duties, must not approve things which are contrary to the faith, contrary to tradition. But that doesn't mean that we're forbidden from introducing even new things, for example. So he's just simply outlining what's legitimate, what's not legitimate, but establishing the principle that the church can change these things.
Right. Archbishop Lefebvre, when he was going through this process of trying to, again, he was in the thick of it, trying to understand, all right, do we follow this missal, that missal? Do we, the variations, what were, and again, we talked about this, but can you remind me of the principles that he followed so that we can kind of have them in mind as we talk about this?
It's he writes in a Superior General's letter back in 83 that the basic principle of the Society's thinking and action in this painful crisis is going to act through the principle taught by St. Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologica, that one may not oppose the authority of the church except in imminent danger to the faith.
Okay.
So that's what we're going on here. We choose a certain missal, we choose a certain rite, we reject other ones. Fair enough, but we do that only when the faith is in immediate danger or the faith is at stake. And that's not the case with the 56 changes to Holy Week. Aesthetically, liturgically, symbolically, practically, we might think them good or bad, but none of those things added or removed touch on the faith, really. Even the most objectionable changes, like the Paschal Mystery reference on Good Friday that some people say, that's the introduction of this new theology. It doesn't actually undermine any doctrine. It's a very old prayer.
It is.
Does it maybe introduce an idea? Sure. And in fact, that's a fair criticism. We started making all these changes. It just opens the door to more changes. It habituates us to things being changed. That's a fair, I think, argument as to why maybe we went too far. And we can object, though, to the new prayer of Benedict XVI, though, on the grounds of the faith. That's why the Society doesn't use it. It's not that I guess you could say, it's not that it is heterodox in itself, but it certainly changes the notion, the idea that is behind the prayer that is in the liturgy, and certainly could admit of some erroneous or ambiguous ideas about the Jews in those cases. So that's why we don't keep that one. And we don't just keep new changes that the Pope decides to do outside of, we want to go back to the original official edition. And then when the church, again, in her sanity, can make these kinds of decisions, we don't want just always a moving target either. That we have to be careful about that.
Right.
And of course, we don't just claim tradition. Otherwise one could claim that for the Novus Ordo. Not legitimately, but we refuse that, of course, yes, but we keep what the last pope has done. And oddly enough, you'll find a lot of sedevacantists will reject, in fact, the new Holy Week, and yet they accept Pius XII as pope, right? And this is where I think you start to get into the arguments about Father Bonini. If those things that he's done, or that the Pian Commission did with the changes to Holy Week, are contrary to the faith, well, it seems like logically a sedevacantist would have to reject Pius XII as a legitimate pope, but not anyone but the most crazy layman actually do that.
Right.
And yet they don't accept the rite that he promulgated because it's tainted, and as it were. So again, that's the same kind of problem. It's operating on a personal preference or a judgment that one doesn't really have the authority to make. So
right. Why did the Holy Week get changed? I guess let's start to dive into the meat of the actual topic here after about 25 minutes of some principle laying.
Yeah.
What were the changes and why?
So we can't go through a full treatise. That would take hours. Hour-long podcast. We're going to try to shoot for an hour to maybe an hour and a half. I might go that long, but
sure.
We can briefly look at what changed and give some reasons for it. Let's try to, as we go through, make a brief comparison of the rites overall, and then I'm going to try to go back to individual ones in particular. I have some slides set up that we can look through to kind of compare them. But in order to isolate my biases a bit, let's ask the question first: what's better about the rite before 1956? I'm going to say practically it's far better because there's less movement around the sanctuary. There's fewer ministers that are needed. You don't have to change the vestments quite as often in certain cases. And that happens because these things develop as an organic whole. Over time, something is compiled anew. Over time, when something is put together, a lot of the excesses just kind of like, we thought that was a good idea, but it doesn't really work. So we're not going to do that anymore. But when you have somebody draft up something, especially when it's by committee, you don't necessarily always have everything thought about. So one of the problems is you tend to sometimes narrowly focus on one thing, the text of a rite or its symbolism, and you ignore some other practical concerns. So the ease of moving around a sanctuary, how to keep a large candle lit in windy conditions, how many servers you need, whether that's actually possible for a small church, etc. I'll give you an example with the Good Friday rite, the older one. The candles, 6 unbleached candles, and the cross that's veiled are already on the altar. Only the linens were stripped off on Holy Thursday in the older rite. And so transitioning from the first part of the ceremony to the second part where the adoration of the cross is there is very natural. You don't need to leave the church. You don't need to go to the sacristy. It's all right there. But now, because in order to give this sense of barrenness there, all of that stuff's taken away and now it's brought back in. There's some symbolism there, yes, but it's kind of impractical, having to go in and out, et cetera. So that's one problem when you change things. When you change things by sort of committee, or you sometimes run into that Chesterton principle that we were talking about last time, right? You see something, you don't understand why it's there, and you say, let's get rid of this because it seems superfluous or not congruous with what we're trying to do here. Example here. You'll find in the changes of the Paschal Vigil that the reformers looked at that rite at the beginning with the blessing of the new fire, and they said, well, it's not just the fire, it's the Paschal candle that's a central element here. And if you look at it, the priest never actually blesses the Paschal candle in the old rite. He just doesn't. And he never pronounces any words over it. He doesn't even touch it until the blessing of the baptismal water in the font. And so what they did was, okay, instead of carrying this triple reed in, this triple candle on a reed in, we're going to have that candle blessed, and we're going to bring the Paschal candle in. And in fact, what's really going on there is, if you look at the older rite, it talks about the blessing of the Paschal candle being done by the deacon, in fact. Mm-hmm. And in fact, the church throughout history has granted deacons powers to bless. Lectors, for instance, can bless bread and new fruit. It's kind of a thing. Once you ordain a lector, you go out and buy a loaf of bread and say, hey, watch this, kind of, but a deacon, and when I was a deacon, I did a sick call. And at the end of giving communion, you're supposed to give a blessing just like a priest. The ritual instructs you to do that. So obviously the church supplies those things. And in fact, the Precunium Paschale, or the Exultet that we sing, in fact, was the deacon blessing the candle. He inserts the grains of incense. He sings about the candle. He asks the blessing of God on these things and on everybody. It's through a preface, which is exactly how through a church is consecrated, Easter water is blessed, candidates for orders are ordained in a preface. So even the missal itself, like I said, in the old rite says, after that preface that he sung, the deacon, the Exultet, the blessing of the Paschal candle being completed, the deacon takes off his white vestments. So it was suggesting that this was a blessing itself. And it's easy for us to zoom out and say, oh, well, maybe that was a change or something like that. But maybe there's a reason that was there. Sort of a highlight of the deacon's year, as it were, to be able to do this. So that's a problem with these kind of changes. So why change? Maybe there's good reason, but we have to be careful that we're not forgetting certain things. And also, I say the third thing that we can forget is that there are differences in the church in how liturgy is celebrated. Rites in a parish are going to be very different from a monastery. There's baptisms in parishes. There's typically not too many baptisms at a monastery. And normally there shouldn't be, in fact. The right, therefore, to monastery or a cathedral where there'd be lots of canons who can offer longer forms is certainly going to be different than a small parish. And there were, in the Memorale Rituum that was promulgated by the Holy See, the old rite was adapted for these kinds of things. Now the new rite has just a simple and solemn form, and maybe we overthought that, for instance. So.
Okay.
But overall, I would say the symbolism and logic of the older ceremonies makes more sense and follows a more understandable thread. But there was something problematic about those older rites, I would say.
Well, you got me on the edge of my seat. What we just talked about, what are the good ones? What are some things that are, I mean, I guess this would answer the question, why was it changed at all?
Right. And that's precisely what I think we should think about, is that it wasn't just arbitrary changes here. There are certainly some areas that were worth revision, or at least addressing, and the main reason, and the reason that Pius the 12th will begin this work, is because these ceremonies were very poorly attended and extremely poorly understood. There wasn't a lot of catechesis, and people just, because they were in the morning, just didn't attend them, right? The timing of the ceremonies is a real problem then. Now, why were they in the morning? Well, in the monastic life, there's a few theories about this. This seems to make the most sense to me, but it's one of many theories. The monks were obliged to fast until Vespers on fast days. After Vespers, they could take their meal. It's kind of hard to last all day when you're doing the kind of heavy work a monk is doing all day long and not eating anything. And so what they started doing is just saying Vespers a little bit earlier. Eventually, they started saying Vespers at noon, and that shifted everything back around in the office. And the Mass is supposed to happen after terce, which means it has to happen always in the morning, because none, the last hour, has to be at 9 o'clock in the morning rather than at 3 p.m. So you're shifting everything around by 6 to 12 hours in this case. And that was already being done in the 9th century. And there were several efforts even in the 10th century to stop doing that. This is actually where you get the whole idea tenebrae. If you shift everything around, Matins and Lauds happens the night before.
Right.
And now is a ceremony about darkness, etc. So in any case, because Mass never would happen after Vespers, because the liturgical day is over or the new one has started, now Mass was restricted to the morning, and these ceremonies are all considered Masses, and so they have to happen in the morning. So one theory for why these things were when they were. But then, of course, as a result, the Easter Vigil, being a Mass, has to be celebrated before noon. Mm-hmm. So now you have this weird thing with the Easter Vigil in the morning. And that makes timing for most people who work, for instance, absolutely impossible. Mm-hmm. The ceremonies also were pretty long, and they had grown in length over the years. Yes, more or less the same since St. Pius V, but 12 prophecies, that's really difficult to perform. The cathedral, for instance, would be the place where you would have not only the Vesperal Mass, which was not Vesperal, it was matutinal, it was in the morning, and the blessing of the oils would happen there as well. So now this ceremony probably wasn't going to be attended much, and priests needed to come to celebrate with the bishop and also to receive their holy oils, and that made it much less likely that they were going to do these things in their parishes. But then simply changing the times, if that's the main objection, starts introducing problems as well. Okay, holy oils at Mass, but that's now in the evening. And so how are the priests going to attend at all if now people will want to come to these ceremonies because they can come in the evening? So now the solution, a chrismal Mass in the morning for the bishop. So now once you start changing the things, and the time, I would say, is the main problem, you start having to modify the rites somewhat. Now, I think what happened is the opportunity for fixing a couple of things, especially with regards to the time. Well, now this introduced the opportunity to change a lot more things. Mm-hmm. But even if you think it was imprudent what they changed, these are, again, personally approved by Pius XII. None were done, and I'll back this up with a good argument for it later, perhaps. None were done in view of the Novus Ordo. This was not what the reformers had in mind. They weren't looking to eventually get there. That's different from perhaps what was going on during the Second Vatican Council. But at this point in time, The actual people who are on this Pian Commission are not ones that are trying to push towards something they're going to see in the future. That was really Father Bonini and others at the Second Vatican Council. Yes, were they working that way already? Sure. But they didn't have the kind of influence that I think we try to give them in order to make a fairly bad argument for or against these changes. And again, remember, as all assert, none of those changes were something unorthodox or diminished the faith as we have in the Novus Ordo.
This is, that's a huge point, which we're going to get to in a second. Sounds like I'm introducing a commercial break. I'm not. We don't have commercials. But one thing I want to pause on and tell me to shut up if this is too much of a tangent. But if I'm following your logic, and again, this is based on your research and your study, maybe there are other reasons, but it sounds like all of the changes to the Holy Week happened and the movement of times to the morning, et cetera, happened because of hungry monks. Would it not have been just an exercise here just for kicks? Would it not have been better to allow them to have a fast-ish snack in the morning and then keep all of this the way it was, and then we wouldn't have been in this problem?
Well, perhaps that's where you actually get. Remember the collations? You hear about that when we're talking about that. That's what collationes were, the book that they would read at certain points in time, and you were allowed to eat a small amount while they were reading that. So these things were changed, but the rites had already started to change. And it wasn't just one thing. I mean, that's one theory for why some of those changes were introduced, not just hungry monks. And they can eat, let me tell you. They do a lot of good hard work. So,
okay, so the Bonini problem, this is the one that I think is really sticky for a lot of folks, and I totally understand it, and I'm empathetic with it about, hey, but these changes, but Father Palko, these changes were done by Father Bonini and these guys who wanted liturgical reform, and you're saying not a big deal? Come on.
Well, if he had the influence that people would try to assert, and that he even tries to suggest that he had, then I think there's a fair argument. Problem is that the best, more recent research, biographies and various other things, notes from Cardinal Antonelli, who at the time Father Antonelli, who was the head of the Pian Commission and then involved in some of the things that he sort of turns into an arch nemesis of Bonini, even though he has some of the same ideas, I think. We mentioned Father Bonini in the last episode. I don't want to extend that too much here, but he's often claimed to basically be, like he was for the Novus Ordo, the author of these Holy Week changes. And that's why some people will reject them. And it's certainly true. From 1948 onward, he was on this Pian Commission, this commission that was going to try to suggest things for a possible liturgical reform, a general one. But he was the secretary of this commission. The secretary, all he does is compile the notes, send out the messages, invite people to their things, share with them the documents. It's the prefect, usually a cardinal or an archbishop. In this case, it was Cardinal Micara on this commission. He was the head of the Sacred Congregation of Rites at the time, who compiles the materials and then communicates those to the Pope. He reports to the Pope directly. And the commission has many members. So was Bonini on the commission? Yes. What kind of influence does he have? He's a very young priest at this point in time. He's 12 years a priest, which is relatively young. I'm saying that as 8 years a priest myself. So I'm, et cetera. Maybe I'll start changing the liturgy at some point in time here too. No, kidding, of course.
Please don't.
No, and it's, of course, he will become infamous for his work on what we'll call the concilium. Right. It's the Concilium ad exequendum consultationem de sacra liturgiae. That's the Vatican II, post-Vatican II. We're going to implement Sacrosanctum Concilium, and maybe not in the way that they were thinking. And the Novus Ordo very much is his brainchild. It's his. Easily provable. And it's also true that in La Riforma Liturgica, he makes grand claims about his work in the changes, and also with regard to Father Carlo Braga, who is considered his sort of right-hand man. Okay. But what's interesting is that when he writes about this, he recounts in the third person his role, which is already sort of an interesting way of doing it. It wasn't like, look at me. It was like, and Father Bonini, who is the editor-in-chief of the Ephemerides Liturgiae, this journal, because he talks about in his sort of autobiography, he talks about how he sent out surveys as this editor-in-chief to bishops in the 1950s about what they wanted changes. And then he analyzes their responses and then publishes those kinds of things. I don't want to accuse him of just blatant plagiarism, but it's kind of hard to here. The historical section of the Sacred Congregation of Rites, a group of scholars, had been working on suggestions and sort of an historical survey of the Roman liturgy since 1930. They've been working on this sort of presentation for the Pope. It took them 20 years to write something and then present it. And this, what they call the Memoria, in this case, this Memoria is more or less sort of kind of stolen by Bonini when he's publishing these things. And he's saying, oh, this is what the bishops want from there. Effectively, what he seems to try to label himself in this as though he was a great influencer through his publication, when in fact he was just kind of echoing what already was going on, and maybe engaging in just a touch of academic dishonesty on this front. And the other problem is he sort of attributes to Father Braga a lot of influence, but Father Braga wasn't on the commission until 1960. He attended 4 meetings, and that was it. So he had really no influence over the liturgical, certainly not over the Holy Week changes. And later along, Bonini and Braga, in their journal, Ephemerides Liturgiae, they write commentary on the Holy Week changes. And they claim that these commentaries were crucial in moving the whole changes along. But of course, they had access to this historical report. So again, they were sort of just saying, well, here's what the historical, look at, we're publishing these things and now people want these things. Based off of a biography by Yves Chiron, which we mentioned before, and then Cardinal Antonelli's personal memoirs, best we could say here is Bonini's claims of his influence seem to be not entirely honest. I'll put it that way. Sure. A bald-faced lie would be a better way of putting it, but let's give him the benefit of the doubt here. He was a young priest. He was knowledgeable about pastoral liturgy. He was very good at organizing things. That's probably his principal characteristic, is his organization, and he could be very sly about those kinds of things. In fact, the Novus Ordo is a good example of that. He's secretary. He has really little direct influence, but he had an external form to promote himself, and then try to sort of patch up his image after the fact. In fact, the majority of those changes up until 1962 are very clearly Father Antonelli's work, along with the historical section of the Congregation of Rites. And remember, like I said, they were developing these ideas for 20 plus years. They don't have anything that looks like the Novus Ordo in there, right? They're not looking to go to that extreme. So it's hard to say that these changes are in line with the Novus Ordo when we very clearly see that that's not what they're looking at. That's not where they're going. And Bonini had almost zero to do with that historical section. He simply copy edited the final draft. Okay. That was it. That was his role. He made no textual contributions to the Memoria. And later along, he tries to even wipe Cardinal Antonelli's name from the attribution to this Memoria, instead attributing the work to the assistant of Cardinal Antonelli, Father Lowe, despite the fact that it was signed by Cardinal Antonelli. And then at Antonelli's consecration, Bonini got up and gave a speech at the banquet, and he praised Antonelli's leadership role in the memorial, but he, in his later biography, won't mention him at all. You can see that Antonelli and he ended up becoming kind of bitter enemies for good reason. In fact, the minutes of the commission show very little influence of Bonini at all. So I guess we
Bonini was in this commission. He was a secretary. Mm-hmm. Seems right. Like after the fact, gave himself a lot more kudos for having done all the work, but it seems like he didn't. And we're pretty certain he didn't.
we're pretty certain now that he didn't have the kind of influence that he claims he had. And we could very much say, if you look at the historical sections report that became the basis for many of these changes, again, maybe some of those historical evidences are not as solidly based as we thought that they were, or that the commission thought that they were, arguably there. Certainly, they're not done in view of the Novus Ordo. Otherwise, you would see that in the historical sections report. Yeah. And the similarities between things in the Novus Ordo and this are really just material similarities, not formal similarities. You need an intention to go there for that. So
even though Bonini was on it, even though Bonini is the quote unquote, for terms of this argument, even though Bonini is the bad guy of the concilium, which came up with the Novus Ordo, me say, even though he's on it, saying, but Bonini is the author, doesn't hold water here in this argument.
Right. I would very, very much argue that. And we can't just say, well, Bonini came up with the Novus Ordo, so everything that he was involved with at all must therefore be bad. And you do tend to see this, and this is where I take a little bit of I don't know, offense isn't the right word. I take a little bit of the assault. Yeah. And when you read very good things, like I mentioned, Gregory de Pippo before, a great series in 2009 and then some stuff later on the changes on the Holy Week. Great work. But you can see that that's still like the basis for this is this idea that, Bonini is behind this, and the reformers, even wrote at one point in time, the people who did the reforming had no interest whatsoever in returning to ancient traditions or maintaining them. They decided beforehand what they were going to do. Then they found an excuse to do it in ancient sources. I don't think that's very honest if you're trying to survey these things. I mean, that may be true, but it's a big claim. And you're going to have to claim that these people had very bad intentions from the beginning, set themselves up for 20 years before Pius XII, and were working on this. And then Bonini is actually a non-issue in there because he was just the implementer at the end of what evil people were doing in the Vatican since 1930.
Right. And there's no evidence to support that was happening from the 30s on. There just isn't.
We don't have it. If it was there, it's great to produce it, but we just simply don't have it.
And until we have it, then you can't make the argument.
Yeah, or you can make the claim, but it's evidence free.
Right. Okay.
So I think the best thing here is when you're in this kind of a situation, we want to charitably presume stupidity rather than evil motives, right?
Yep.
Imprudence rather than evil motives. So the men who are doing this, I think we have to presume that they thought they were doing something good. They thought they were doing something in line with tradition and history. And they didn't see that they were opening the door for evil people like Bonini later to do evil things with the liturgy. Now, I'm not saying that, in fact, there's the people like Mr. De Pippo, their critiques are not welcome. I agree with most of what he says. In fact,
sure.
I like what he says, but we can't just simply look at everything that has changed and put its origin in some kind of guile-filled effort to undermine the faith and move towards the Novus Ordo. I don't think that's fair. I don't think that's helpful to look at it that way.
Yeah. This is a perfect example of Hanlon's razor.
Mm-hmm. Right.
This is it.
Exactly.
All right. So let's look at the reform itself. What happened?
So it starts with the Pian Commission creating a new or revised, depending how you look at it, Easter Vigil. And that all started in about 1950. The French and German bishops had collectively sent to Pius XII a petition asking permission to have Holy Week ceremonies in the evening. And they wrote in their letter, it's striking because a lot of times you'll hear people say, when Father Palko claims, for instance, that no one attended these ceremonies because of the times and everything like that, is just false and it's, historically not. The bishops said that. They said in their letter, the ceremonies are celebrated without any faithful assisting. Just bluntly would put it that way. And then they'll say, many priests, especially in cities and suburbs who care for souls, and also not a few faithful who are active in Catholic action. Remember, this is a big movement of good, devout Catholics.
Yep.
Have repeatedly sent their ordinaries, bishops, request the various ceremonies be celebrated later in the evening or even at night because they are unable to attend due to their work. Now, remember that the Triduum was originally a set of holy days of obligation. You didn't work, you got the day off.
Right.
It was struck by the fact that down in New Zealand, when I was stationed down there, Good Friday was still a day off of work. It was a national holiday.
Yeah.
And not only that, but you wanted to have after everything's done, just a slice of pizza to kind of break the fast at the end of the day. Good luck. Couldn't get it. Which is interesting to say. Such a secular and a country without, majority of people don't profess any religion, and Good Friday is still a holy day of obligation, or not holy day of obligation, but a day off from work.
Yeah.
But for the last 300 years, in most places, that's not been the case. The Triduum hasn't been a day of obligation, and so nor a work holiday. And so people are often obliged to work on those days. And that was really the major reasoning why Pius X or Pius XII would change the time here of the Easter Vigil and ask that a new vigil be written in order to accommodate that. And also why he would grant permission in 1953 for evening masses as well. That was something that St. Pius V had forbade back in I believe it was 1568, if I'm not mistaken. He said no more evening masses. They have to happen before noon. Pius XII said, no, we're going to have evening masses again. He rescinds that prohibition on this idea. Maybe people will come in the evening to a mass from time to time, maybe after work, for instance. Mm-hmm. So these petitions are communicated to the Sacred Congregation for Rites, and the Holy Father says, I want to give him this permission, but we're going to need to change some of the rites for this to happen. Start with the Easter Vigil. And that's where we get the 1951 changes of the Easter Vigil, which is more or less the changes that we have now in 1956. So let's look at those perhaps really briefly here.
Okay.
And so what did the older rite look like in comparison with the newer? Let's just go side to side. And I have some slides for this here. So at the beginning, those of you who have attended the Paschal Vigil will see that there's the blessing of the new fire. So in the older rite, before 1951, there were three different prayers. The first one, Deus qui per filium tuum, blesses the new fire. The second one, Domini Deus Pater, blesses the fire under the terms light. And then there's a later one that doesn't bless anything. It's just a prayer. They've reduced that in the 1951 and after rite to one single prayer, the first of those that blesses the fire, simplifying things. So then after that, we bless the incense, in the old rite, the nails of incense that are going to go in. The candle isn't blessed. It's already in the church. And the grains of incense are blessed with the words veniat quaesimus. In the newer rite, the candle at this point in time is marked with a cross, the alpha and the omega, the year, with a formula that is created for that. It's a new formula based off of old ideas, but it is a new formula. The incense grains are inserted out there, and then the candle, along with the incense grains, when they're put together, are blessed with a very similar prayer that adds the candle into there. So this is where, as I mentioned before, this is where we have a little bit of a departure from this idea of the diaconal blessing, but it's worth mentioning here that the candle is blessed at this point in time. So
okay.
Then after that, there is the procession into the church. In 1951, the Paschal candle is already in the church on its stand. The deacon therefore carries in a triple branch candle on a stick, a reed. He will sing at various times the Lumen Christi, probably familiar with that. And each time another branch of that three-branched candlestick is lit. The lights are going to stay off until the middle of the Exultet. On the other hand, in the newer rite, the deacon will carry the actual Paschal candle into the church because it's been blessed outside. He sings the Lumen Christi, but this time the Paschal candle is giving its light, its fire to first the acolytes' candles and then the tapers of the faithful. And then at the end, the lights of the church are turned on.
Okay.
After this, we have the Exultet, the Praeconium Paschale. So the candle is in its normal position over on the gospel side. At this point in time, there's a pulpit put in front of it. In the older rite, the deacon will sing the Exultet, and he is blessed by the priest like at the gospel. He incenses the book that has the exultet there. He starts singing the exultet, and he'll stop at various points in time, first to insert the incense grains, then to light the candle, and after that, so the lights of the church can be turned on. The Reform, wanting to carry this idea of candles, gives the faithfuls tapers. And so the candle, instead of being put off to the side here, because they want centrality of the candle, it's in the center. The deacon sings the exultet in very much the same way, except that he doesn't stop at any point in time to do anything. He sings the exultet, and the candle, because the incense is already in there, it's already lit, but he doesn't stop. After that, there are the lessons. The celebrant will change from his chasuble, which he was wearing to begin with, change into a chasuble from his cope. The priest wears a chasuble in imitation of Mass at this point in time. So these lessons are sort of like epistles, as it were.
Okay.
He's going to have to read them, though. He has to read every single one or sing every single one if there's not lectors. And each is followed by a prayer. But the 4th, the 8th, and the 11th of them are followed by a responsory or a canticle. Compare that to the Reform, the rite that was done in 1951 and on. The celebrant just stays in cope. He doesn't change into a chasuble here. The lectors have 4 lessons to sing that he listens to them reading, or he sings himself at a book stand. He doesn't read if he's not singing aloud. And they retain 4 lessons, the 1st, the 4th, the 8th, and the 11th. Notice that 3 of those have responsories after them. They picked them for that reason. And each is followed by a prayer. And then the last 3, like I said, have that responsory or canticle. Then we proceed to the blessing of the font. The celebrant is going to change from his violet chasuble into a cope. So he goes back to the cope that he had on beforehand. So anyone complaining about the old rite and how many vestment changes there are in the new one, he's going back and forth in this rite too. Now, the main difference here is that the ceremony happens at different places. In the older rite, it happens in the baptistry or at the font, whereas the ceremony in the newer rite happens up at front of the sanctuary so people can see this and they don't have to go on a procession or just hear these things going on in a distance. Server is going to bring the paschal candle all the way to the baptistry and then back, whereas the server doesn't need to do that in the new rite. Instead of the Sicut Cervus, which was sung on the way to the baptistry in the older rite, the first part of the litanies prefaces the blessing of the holy water, and then the baptismal water after that. In the actual blessing of the font, the prayer Omnipotens Respice is sung. That will be sung later in the 1951 rite. And then the preface of the blessing is sung. Baptism is given at the font. And then the litany finishes off this part before the Mass that will follow. In the rite from 1951 to 1969, the preface is sung up in front. The baptism is given in the sanctuary into a small bowl that's there to collect the water. And then after the baptisms, the baptismal water itself is brought in procession, not the candle, to the font. And then the font is blessed with back there. And then there continues an entirely new thing with this renewal of baptismal promises. And then the litany finishes things out, only the second part. And then after that, you have the Vigil Mass of Easter. It's essentially the same in both rites. The only difference is after communion. Instead of a section that substitutes for Vespers of Easter, there is a section that substitutes for Lauds of Easter. Because at the end of the day, Lauds is the first thing you sing, not Vespers from the night before. So,
okay.
So a little summary of the changes here. And the Paschal Vigil is going to be one of the ones that we go into most in depth here, because not only is it sort of the majority of the changes, but I think it gives us a sense for what kinds of changes and what purpose is behind it, since we don't really have time to go in depth on everything. So in any case, summary here, the Paschal candle is blessed. The fire is carried by the deacon instead of the triple branch candle. The fire is carried on the Paschal candle. The exultet is no longer a diaconal blessing, but a laus cherry, a praise of the Paschal candle, of course, of our Lord, who's the symbol there. 8 lessons are omitted. and the priest no longer must read at the altar, but there are 4 that are retained. The Litany of the Saints is divided up. The blessing of the baptismal water happens in the sanctuary rather than in the baptistry, and it's transported to the baptistry. Then there's this new renewal of baptismal promises and the switch between pro vesperis and pro laudibus, the section substituting for vespers versus the section substituting for lauds. So that's really the main changes there.
So are they good? Are they bad? Are they prudential? Are they indifferent? So I mean, I guess we apply the same test to the, we apply the same test that we apply when we decide about the Novus Ordo Mass.
Absolutely.
Is it bad enough, quote unquote, are these changes, quote unquote, bad enough or substantial enough that we have to go, whoa, stop, we got to go back?
And spoiler alert, no.
Okay.
But let's understand that, because we could say that these changes really, and what we've discussed about these changes, are really about the material differences in them.
Yep.
And that's an important point there, because you could say the Novus Ordo and the traditional Latin Mass are, in fact, materially similar on certain things, right? We wouldn't say they're formally or finally similar. The formal final aspect of something is really important, not just material similarity, right? Do these changes change the meaning of the rite? Do they change the purpose of the rite? And in order to understand that, let's look at the intentions of those who are reforming. So just quickly to prove this, let's look at the Novus Ordo. What do they change? Do the changes that make up the Novus Ordo change the meaning of the rite? Cardinal Ottaviani says absolutely they do. That was his big complaint in the brief study, the Ottaviani intervention. And of course, their purpose is different. Their purpose is statedly humanistic. It's not about a sacrifice offered to God. It's about a Paschal meal together. It's about the memory of the Passion or of our Lord. It's not about this propitiatory sacrifice, not as clearly at least. And finally, the intention, very clearly, to reduce the Catholicity of this ceremony to a more Protestant-style rite. So that's why we reject the Novus Ordo. And it's a formal and final difference that we're seeing there. What about these changes in the Paschal Vigil? Now, again, I've stated my preferences here, so it's not as if I'm going to try to be an apologist for these changes, of course.
Right.
But do any of the changes change the meaning of the rite?
Nope.
No. Simply no. None of them change what the rite means. In fact, you could even argue that the centrality of the Paschal candle being a symbol for our Lord's resurrection, rather than all of these extra lessons talking about the history, there's now only 4 lessons versus 8. One could make the argument, I won't, but one could make the argument, I think legitimately, that then in fact there's a more central focus on the resurrection itself here.
Yeah.
But be that as it may, do they change the meaning of the rites? No, not in any substantial way. Do they change the purpose of the rite? Yeah, no, not in any substantial way either. And what were the intentions of the reformers? All you need to do is look at the stated intentions and the principles that were guiding them, that they stated about this reform of the Easter Vigil. First principle that they write: retain everything belonging to the primitive rite found in the best tradition. Now, maybe they didn't have good sources for this thing and decided to come up with something new, or et cetera. They whiffed on this one because they didn't have good research. Entirely possible, but they clearly say that they want to retain the most primitive rite. They don't want to do anything to what has been there all along. They want to sort of trim away certain things, but they don't want to affect the most primitive rite, the central part of it. The second principle that they say is they want to revive important elements which had been lost or modified or had become deformed. That is, they started to take on a new focus that wasn't really the focus that they were originally intended for. Good, bad, indifferent. Clearly, that's not the purpose of the Novus Ordo. You can see the formal differences here between those two things.
Yeah.
Restore the liturgical action of the Paschal candle and its position of material and symbolic centrality. They wanted the focus on the Paschal candle. And in order to do that, the carrying of the Paschal candle makes a lot of sense, in fact. Does it lose some symbolism from like the soul of Christ coming in and then being, seeing the resurrection, as it were? Well, perhaps. But also then it sort of takes the Paschal candle and sort of says, well, we're going to do something with the Paschal candle, but the fire is a really important thing, or these lessons are the really important thing. You can see where there at least is an argument there for that.
Mm-hmm.
The fourth principle, and their last principle, is ensure that people are able to follow the liturgical action consciously and actively rather than merely as passive spectators. Now, that's a phrase that we talked about in the participation in the liturgy.
Yep.
They didn't mean here that the people started to say and do things necessarily. It's that they wanted them to be able to focus and understand and clearly participate in that way.
That this is an important catechesis and the people should be able to follow it more clearly. And that's a perfect application of what Pius X was talking about with liturgical participation. Correct.
And that's why, you could argue about it. Maybe it makes sense to do the blessing of the water, not at the font, important as that might seem, but in front of everybody, so everyone can at least more or less see what's going on, or at least understand what's going on, hear what's going on, and not in the baptistry, which is perhaps halfway down the church or in entirely another building that they can't go to, for instance. We have to think in European terms too. In old American churches, the baptismal font might have been right in front of like St. Joseph's altar over there, or it might have been just in the back of the church. But sometimes the baptistry was an entirely separate building, like, down the block away. So,
yeah. So none of these changes have any sniff of degradation of the theology, the spirit, all of it. Again, we can quibble about whether or not they were prudent or we like them better, but theologically, doctrinally, no issues.
Well, I think you could make an argument that some of them start to affect theology, but I don't think they affect it in such a direct and clear way. What you're looking for there is, I think it's the difference between somebody who is how should I put this? Somebody who's trying to explain things in a simple manner versus somebody who is trying to consciously make ambiguous a certain point. So they're trying to simplify these rites so that people can understand them better. In doing that, it is perhaps that they are not 100% as clear. Like, for instance, remove those lessons. And maybe certain aspects of the Old Testament history you miss out on, and maybe there's an important point in there that isn't in the liturgy somewhere else. But you have to be careful that that's yes, you're leaving that out, but maybe that's actually distracting from the whole point. For example, I'm not sure I'd make that argument, but just an example there of how these aren't changes which diminish the faith in the same way that we object to in the Novus Ordo, put it that way.
Sure.
And what's interesting here too is that Cardinal Antonelli explains his own descriptions for why they made these changes. So we don't have to also go any further than just looking at his notes on these things. They say the blessing of the new fire, the reduction of that prayer is because there were two prayers, originally two options. And in fact, now both are said along with a third prayer that are from different traditions. And so we're just going to go back to the one Roman tradition with the one prayer for the blessing of the fire. The Paschal candle, well, the only reason this started being a triple reed, bringing it in, was bringing the fire in on instead of the Paschal candle coming in, was because they started creating very big Paschal candles. Right? Salisbury Cathedral, it said that the Paschal candle during the Middle Ages was about 30 feet tall. It would burn throughout the entirety of the Paschal season. So,
not carrying that in.
Right. World's strongest man competition, maybe, but and some of those Russian deacons, maybe they feel like they could, lift up 30. No. So you couldn't do it. And so something was substituted for it. And the idea that, this represents the Trinity. No, it doesn't. It was just, it was
practical.
It was practical. And then symbolism, as we've talked about before, symbolism began being added to certain things that wasn't originally there. So they don't mention the change in the deacon's role in the notes, though. So that's a little troubling to see that they did that. But that being said, they kept the prophecies that were baptismal rite preparations very clearly. The creation narrative, the crossing of the Red Sea, very clearly a symbol of baptism. The joy of the Messianic kingdom is told by Isaiah, and the Canticle of the Vine, and then the witness of Moses being an admonition to faith fidelity once one was baptized. And even so, the prophecies weren't part of any mass. They were never considered that way. So, for instance, the use of the chasuble seems kind of out of place, a needless change of clothing, perhaps. Maybe this is Chesterton's principle, maybe it's not. But and the desire to remove the duplication of duties, the priest having to read everything a second time at the altar, was already something that had been desired for a very long time beforehand. Even St. Pius X talks about doing that. So the priest remains sitting. Practically speaking, when you're really tired at the end of a very long Holy Week, it's kind of nice to be able to just listen to the prophecies. Again, personal preference here, but so maybe I shouldn't, liturgically decide on those kinds of things. I'm going to follow my own principles. But why a reduction to 4? The group says that they simply thought that not everybody could do all 12, especially when the duties would fall on a single priest. And in fact, the number varied over the year. At the time of St. Gregory the Great, on to the 12th century, only the 4 that are now retained were used. The others were added later. And oddly enough, the Dominican rite during this time, before any changes in the 1950s, only had 4 as well. And I believe it's the same 4.
Interesting.
So there's also, remember, dividing up the litany. Sometimes people will complain about that idea, but it was done during the Middle Ages. Durandus, a famous liturgist himself, and hymn writer of hymns and music, he mentions that they would divide this up for certain things before the blessing of the font, and then after. The change the place of the baptismal water blessing was purely pastoral, but it wasn't the font that was blessed. It was the baptismal water, right? The prayers are exactly the same. And admittedly, the renewal of baptismal promises is an innovation. It's entirely made up, and it kind of sounds a bit, it sounds a bit like it was from the 1950s or 1960s.
Yeah.
I mean, admittedly. But the motives were good on this. They expressed, the commission expresses their ideas that what should happen is the faithful should see the tie-in between baptism and the incorporation into the resurrection and Christ's death by this. So they should be able to see this. Is this a good thing to do? Is this a way to do it? I would argue it's probably not, but not the best way of doing it. But hey, it's not something, again, that's the Novus Ordo all over again or anything like that. And of course, we have a guarantee that these things were orthodox because it was the author of Mediator Dei. It was Pius XII who approved these things. So antiquarianism, no, this wasn't that, or at least he didn't see it as that.
Yep, fair. All right, so we've got Paschal Vigil done. Let's keep rolling. Okay, let's look at Palm Sunday.
A lot to cover. And the reason that I put the Paschal Vigil first here and wanted to talk about it first, it was the first one that was done. The other ones all are a part of a change that happened with the decree Maxima Redemptoris Nostrae in 1955 of Pius XII. Okay. So Palm Sunday, principal changes here are that it's a shortened ceremony for the procession. Red vestments are used instead of violet during the procession, and the Passion narrative is shortened, removing the Last Supper and the burial of our Lord. Those are the only changes that are really made. So again, we have a couple of slides to look at the differences here. So from 1570 to 1956, we had this blessing of the palms in the procession that started out with a dry mass. So there is this Gallican sort of tradition of having blessings of important things utilize the form of a mass. You'd have something that looks like an introit, looks like a collect, a lesson or an epistle, a gradual, a gospel, a prayer of blessing that turned into a preface along with the Sanctus, and then the actual blessing itself.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And so that's what the rite looks like in the former the former rite before 1956. So there is this dry mass. It has an introit, it has a collect, it has a lesson. You can choose between graduals. Choices in the liturgy, not a good thing. There's the Gospel of the Palms, And then there's the prayer of blessing into the preface with the Sanctus. And then there's 7 different prayers of blessing. Only 5 of them, I believe, actually impart a blessing. And then the palms are distributed. There's a procession. In the older rite, it stops at the door of the church, which is closed, and then the bottom of the staff of the cross, either carried by the cross bearer or subdeacon, knocks on the door during the singing of the Gloria Laus. And then the door is opened and the entrance there. It's symbolic of the resurrection, in fact. Our Lord going to his suffering on his cross, coming into his kingdom, knocking on the door, heaven is opened. Now, in the rite from 1955 up to 1969, the blessing of the palms has only a single prayer to begin with. The palms are distributed. The singing of the gospel of the palms is made without the gradual and the lesson and the collect from beforehand. And then there's a procession without stopping at the door. Now, what's interesting here is that, and then we'll talk about this one, the society keeps that knocking at the door despite using the newer rite. And that's because it's entirely within the use of the rubrics to do that. It's not against the rubrics to do that.
Okay.
Oddly enough, the same Gloria Laus is in there, and you're allowed to rearrange as you choose the hymns and the canticles that you would sing. You can even sing in the vernacular, and there's nothing wrong with using one of those hymns last and then knocking on the door as you go in.
Okay.
It's not against the rubrics. It's not forbidden, put it that way. So the society retains it.
So y'all aren't a bunch of hypocrites.
Yeah, well, it's praeter legem, as we said before. It's outside of the law, right?
Right.
You can do something, you can retain a custom, and something that's been done for a long time, 500 years or so, certainly is a custom, as long as it's not against the law, and it isn't.
Okay.
So, so the Palm Sunday, I'd like to we won't compare it immediately, but just to back up here, the Palm Sunday procession is actually really ancient. It didn't enter the Roman liturgy until the 10th century. So it's actually quite late in Rome. The former rite that we have that I described there is actually from the Gallican 8th century Bobbio Missal. And the blessing, so the procession enters in the 10th century. The blessing enters in the 12th century. Previously, you would just walk in procession with palms. And then this whole blessing ceremony enters in the 12th century. So it's not as ancient as we might think it was. And it's in a reduced form from the Bobbio Missal. In that pre-1956 rite, it's entirely found in the Missal used by the Roman Curia in the 14th century. So even before the 14th century, there were variations. And because that's the one that's published in 1570 by Pius V, that's the one that we were using.
Got stuck in amber at that point, essentially.
It did, yeah.
Yeah.
So this Gallican procession was always done in honor of Christ the King. Later, it ended up losing this character due to the influence of passion plays in particular, and focused on the historical entrance of Christ into Jerusalem with palms. So the focus became more on the palms rather than on the procession in honor of Christ the King. Now, the argument of the reformers in making these changes is, well, the procession is the most important element. The blessing is great, but long blessings are not Roman in origin, and so we should shorten them. And so the prayers that were originally, as the reformers said, options, whether they were or not, I'm not going to speculate on that. They said they were all used to be options. Now they're all forced to be said. We're just going to reduce that to one prayer. And the character of a dry mass isn't a Roman practice. That's a Gallican practice. So we're going to go back to the Roman practice of a much more simple blessing and distribution. But we want to emphasize the procession should be about, yes, carrying palms, but in honor of the Messianic King. So they switched the color to red, which Cardinal Antonelli says is supposed to correspond with royal purple. Remember, violet is the liturgical color, not purple. But red isn't really a royal color. It's the papal color. So maybe this is where they're getting this idea from. But it's, I think, a bit of a false comparison on that one.
Okay.
But I would like to show you that maybe some of these changes aren't, aren't as novel as we might think they are. Okay. So I'd like to look at, in fact, the Dominican rite from 1939 and compare it with the rite that we use now in the society from after 1956. Because both of them have a single prayer to bless palms. in fact.
Interesting.
So this whole long Gallican thing that was in the Roman liturgy, Dominicans didn't do that. They had a single prayer, albeit much longer, yes. They distribute the palms, they sing the gospel of the palms, and then they process without stopping at the door. And the only difference here is that the newer rite and the Roman rite uses red vestments, and the Dominicans, this is before 1950, of course, were processed in white vestments. So they changed their vestments as well. So everything is very similar. When I found this, I remember I was at the seminary. I was looking through an old Dominican missal that I was trying to rebind. And I was just struck by how similar the older rite in the Dominicans is throughout Holy Week too. In other parts of Holy Week, it's very similar to some of the newer Holy Week rites.
Was there a Dominican in the group who reformed the Holy Week?
I don't know. I don't think so, in fact, oddly enough. So I thought that might have been the case early along, but I haven't found a name in there that was a Dominican. There may have been some.
Okay.
But it's just to show that this is a Latin rite. No one will say that the Dominican rite is like somehow modernist Novus Ordo or anything like that. No, it's a legitimate rite from well before any changes were going on. And this Dominican rite was the same way for a long time. And yet it looks so much like the Reformed rite. Mm-hmm. And so, again, even if you like the old one, like myself, it's hard to then argue that Dominicans were modernist well before, the changes that were made in the Roman liturgy. Right. And even here, too, we see the switching of colors. That's a big objection that some people will come. Like, you never used to do that. Well, in fact, you used to. The Dominican rite did. And then in Candlemas before 1960, you switched from violet to white. In baptism, we still do. So the changing of vestments and colors is a bit of a spurious argument on that anyway.
Sure.
The one thing that's a bit, I guess you could say, objectionable is in the Passion itself on Palm Sunday, the shortening of the Passion itself. The Reformers say they want to focus on the Passion itself, but there, I would say, starts to be some theological problems here by omitting certain things. And the reason for that is because, in fact, the whole of the Passover, Christ ends his Passover by completing the Last Supper, but without that last cup, without that last chalice that he's supposed to drink, which he drinks on the cross, arguably, and his resurrection. So, in fact, the Paschal sacrifice, as it were, the Passover that he completes, goes from the Last Supper all the way to his ascension. So it's all one whole, in fact. And so starting to eliminate things here, say, let's focus on the Passion, I think is a bit of a spurious argument and starts impacting theology, but not to such a degree that it actually minimizes something and is an issue for the faith. Put it that way.
Okay. All right. So that's Palm Sunday. That's a fascinating correlation between Dominicans and the new rite. Well, the new rite, the Reformed rite. Let's dig into Maundy Thursday next.
Okay. Well, so this is actually a fairly easy and short one. Okay. There are very few changes except for the changing of the time. So the principal changes on Maundy Thursday, the Missa in Cena Domini, that is the Mass of our Lord's Supper, the Vesperal Mass as it's called, is moved to after 4 p.m. in the evening. In order to accommodate the blessing of the holy oils, they reconstruct from older texts a chrismal Mass for the morning. No one that I know of objects to this idea, in fact, because there was this older ceremony.
Okay.
Then they include the mandatum, the washing of the feet, which used to be a ceremony carried out in monasteries and in cathedrals in choir amongst the canons or amongst the monks. And now it's put optionally within the Vesperal Mass. You can still do it separately if you'd like. You don't have to do it. It's not required in any of the rites. It's just now introduced and it's allowed for the lay faithful to do this.
Okay.
And then there's a fix at midnight. The adoration at the altar of repose has to stop. Whereas beforehand, it was envisioned it could continue into Good Friday itself. So maybe we just look at what the rites used to look like on Maundy Thursday. The difference is here, like I said, and the Mass has to begin before noon in the older rite, in the newer one after 4 p.m. The Holios were consecrated by the bishop at this only Mass of the day because it was in the morning. But now the Holios are consecrated in the morning at a Chrismal Mass, a separate one. The mandatum used to have to be performed outside of the Mass in choir, but now it can be, doesn't have to be performed in parish churches, and it can use lay people as the people whose feet are being washed. And there's no restrictions on the visiting of the Blessed Sacrament in the old rite, but in the new one, it's only until midnight. And effectively, that's it, right? No one, I wouldn't say no one, but very few people object to any changes on Maundy Thursday, except as it regards Good Friday, with which they have some objections. There are a few changes. They omit the creed. The Agnus Dei has 3 misereres rather than a Dona Nobis Pacem, but that's because you don't give the kiss of peace. The Benedicamus Domini is used because we're going on procession afterward, and the liturgy continues. The Mass isn't finished. Really, it continues on. Like I said, theologically, it's really the Passover continues into Friday and through the Easter Vigil, really actually up until the Ascension. So,
okay.
And that's basically it. That's Good Friday. That's Maundy Thursday. And because there's not many changes, I think that's where we could sort of end that. So,
okay.
But there's yet left Good Friday. And that's probably one of the more significant changes, although on the surface, it seems very textually, materially similar. Okay. So on Maundy Thursday, we strip the altar. But in Good Friday, we come in with the altar not only stripped of all of its linens, but also of its candles and the crucifix. There's just nothing there. Whereas before, the candles and the crucifix, veiled, of course, were left. Now, a new prayer that's absent in the older rite is sung. And they added a prayer. It's from the Gelasian Sacramentary, so it's very traditional. The Mass of the pre-sanctified, or this concept, a Mass where there's no consecration, a previously consecrated host is used, is eliminated. And so the chasuble isn't used throughout until communion. They eliminate the use of incense. They simplify the transfer of the Blessed Sacrament. The faithful are able to receive communion. And then there are 3 prayers added. So we could compare these 2 rites pretty easily. The first part is really, because it's like a Mass, it's considered like a Mass, we could call it the Mass of the Catechumens in the older rite, whereas we call it the reading of the Passion in the newer rite. So the ministers come in, they prostrate themselves. The difference is that now a priest will be in alb and stole, whereas before he was in chasuble and the ministers were in folded chasubles, front folded up. This is imitation of the penitential days on which these ordinations would occur. There's 2 pieces here used for the ministers, the broad stole, which is a very wide stole that goes across and over the deacon's normal stole. It's not actually a stole, in fact. And the folded chasuble, folded up in the front, not in the back. And that was symbolic of the candidate would wear these in during ordinations to the priesthood, which happened on Ember days, penitential days. And so it began that the subdeacon and deacon would wear these things. The broad stole is basically you take a Gothic chasuble and you roll it up and you throw it over your shoulder and then you pin it together. So
if you want to see pictures of it, go back to the vestments episode that Father Palko and I did.
Correct.
Ago. Yep.
Correct. So in any case, okay, so there's a difference in what they're wearing here. At the beginning, an altar cloth is unfurled upon the altar in the older rite, and now it won't be done until the prayers a little bit later along. The celebrant reads at the altar what the lector or subdeacon has to read. The celebrant is going to sit while the lectors read these lessons. And then the Passion is sung in its entirety. And then, like I said, afterward, an altar cloth is unfolded. So you see, materially, it's just sort of a reordering and somewhat different vestments that are used. Now, the continuation of the Mass of the Catechumens, you have the solemn prayers. These used to be said at all Masses, the prayers of the faithful. We have them retained on Good Friday. The celebrant will, in his chasuble, read the prayers from the epistle corner. Now, the celebrant in cope reads them from the center of the altar. There is an issue, and it's actually not as big an issue, though we'll talk about it, with regard to the Jews and the flectamus genua. Now, that's not done in the older rite, and the words perfides and perfidiam are used. In the newer rite, there is the flectamus genua, and until 1959, the word perfides and perfidiam were retained.
Okay.
Continuing on, the minister actually removes their chasubles or stoles for the veneration of the cross, which technically speaking is sort of like the consecration during this mass, this dry mass. So maybe you could say it's sort of between the mass of the catechumens here. The altar on the cross that's on the altar is taken down, and that's used, and the celebrant is brought that by the deacon or a server. He exposes it, and they put it on the altar steps for veneration. Whereas now, the ministers remove all of their vestments except for their stoles, so they're dressed similarly as before. The cross is, though, in the sacristy, so it has to be brought into the church by procession. And afterward, acolytes hold this rather than putting it on the steps on a cushion. And it's possible now for the acolytes even to go, say, down the communion rail to allow the faithful to venerate the cross, just like at communion.
Okay.
Let's see, where were we here? Continuing on, now we have the retrieval of the Blessed Sacrament after this. So in the older rite, the priest, along with the deacon and subdeacon and all the servers, would go to the altar of repose, right? And then they would bring the Blessed Sacrament back with incense. They would say, the priest would place the Blessed Sacrament on the altar, say the Orate Fratres, sing the Pater Noster. There's a Libera Nos, and the celebrant will then divide the large host, place a particle in the chalice. So there is wine used here, but it's not the precious blood. The celebrant alone receives communion. In the newer form, there is this solemn communion. The priest doesn't say Orate Fratres. He sings or recites the Pater Noster. The rubrics imply that all the faithful join, but it simply says dicit, which most people will interpret as to say, but the missal itself oftentimes uses dicit where you're supposed to sing something. So it's entirely possible that this be sung, even though the rubrics suggest that it should be probably recited. The Libera Nos is recited or sung, just like before. A large host isn't used, it's a small host, and the celebrant gives himself communion and then everybody else without using the chalice at all. And then finally, because a chalice is used, the celebrant purifies his fingers in the older rite. There isn't the reservation of any host because he's consumed everything, and the priest's rite ends right there after he's purified everything. In the newer rite, the celebrant purifies his fingers in the ablution bowl. Extra hosts are temporarily reserved in the tabernacle. Personally, when I do this rite, I try to make sure that all of the hosts are consumed because this is much more practical. It's kind of odd than to have to do a transfer of the Blessed Sacrament afterward. You just have to count really well and distribute very prudently. So,
right.
I don't think they could do that in St. Mary's, for instance.
Right.
A little bit more difficult.
Yeah.
But in a smaller chapel where you know there's going to be about a certain number of communions, you can get pretty close. So.
Right.
There are 3 added prayers after communion, and then Compline follows that in the newer rite. So most of the criticism of these changes surrounds the changing of vestments, which seems like it goes back and forth all the time, and also seems like the elimination of the Mass of the Pre-Sanctified. Well, we've seen that vestments actually in the older rite were changed quite frequently as well. And in fact, on Good Friday and other places, they're changed actually fewer times. Yes, to different things back and forth. But so example, the priest uses his, pardon me, the priest uses the black chasuble, but then the subdeacon is going to remove his folded chasuble to sing the lesson and then put it back on. For the Passion, they're all going to remove their chasubles. It's back and forth of removing and putting these things on throughout. So the fact that it's changing, I don't think that's a fairly good argument. It's very inconvenient, but yeah. The Mass of the Pre-Sanctified, I think that's a bigger issue. But while it's reduced or eliminated, it's not reduced much more than what other Latin rites already had. We can go back to the Dominican here just briefly. They don't have any of those offertory prayers that form the Mass of the Pre-Sanctified, though they still consider it so. They bring the Blessed Sacrament back, they incense the altar, they don't incense the altar, just like we don't now, but they used to in the older Roman rite. And it starts with Pater Noster, right? So it's very similar textually to what we do now, the Dominican rite, that is. And the why, by the way, are we looking at this Dominican rite? It bears a minute of mention here. A lot of the people who say what came after 1955 was novel, revolutionary, and there are certain aspects of it that simply aren't. And we can see those by looking at similar rites like that. Now, was it suitable to manufacture some of those things post 1955? Well, it's not a doctrinal question, as we've seen. That's a prudential question. It's not a matter of faith or morals, unless we're going to say the Dominicans were modernists back in 1940. I don't think we want to do that. So
nope, that's a bad idea.
Yeah. Maybe the last little thing here, I mentioned before, it's often that it's objected that the society doesn't, 100% keep the 1962 Holy Week rites.
Right.
True. That's entirely true. And I think it's worthwhile to sort of own that. You will see a few differences if you try to follow along in a 1962 missal, but very few. And what you do see are all differences that are some practice preserved, as we said before, praeter legem, not against the law, not according to the law, outside of the law.
Okay. What
we do is we use this book here. This book here is the 1956 Ordo Hebdomine Sancte Instauratus, the actual book that was put out by the Pian Commission and then the Sacred Congregation of Rites and approved by Pius XII. We use that book right there. And the reason that we use that one is because that's what was available. It's a very practical issue. If you wanted to get one of those things in the 1970s, that's what you got, right? That's what was available. There were changes that were made in 1960, 1959, 1961, and the text had been typeset, but they never published a 1961 edition of that. So effectively, you have to go and find a missal that was published with the changes, with the canon, changes of the canon with St. Joseph's name in 1963 to find those changes in a missal. There weren't too many of those. And just as a practical point, if you want to do Holy Week in 1970, you were finding these in bookshops. This is what you had. And so the society basically was using that, unless there were priests who decided they wanted to do their own thing and use an older missal.
Right.
That's what you were using. So it's a very practical thing. There are a few things that we do that aren't contrary to the rubrics, though, but beyond them. And I mentioned one of them with the knocking of the door with the cross, right? Before 1955, the rubrics are very clear. You're supposed to do that. Afterward, the Gloria Laus is one of many hymns that you can sing during the procession. It's optional. You can arrange them however you want. So we just arrange it so you do what you used to do. But the rubrics are entirely silent on how to do that. In fact, they even suggest you possibly could. So we're not doing anything different than what you would do during a Corpus Christi procession, for instance. Right? During a Corpus Christi procession, oftentimes you stop at an altar that's set up midway along. Right? That's not in the rubrics. That's allowed. It's not said you have to do that. It's not said you can't do that. And that for a far longer ceremony, benediction, than you do by knocking on the door on Palm Sunday.
Right.
So if it's not forbidden, it can be done. It can be done, and we do it.
Okay.
What's interesting, though, is that we do precisely follow the 1956 OHS for Maundy Thursday, precisely in that we omit the second Confiteor. Right? We talked about that last time. This time around, omitting the second Confiteor, well, in 1961, you didn't have to do that anymore. Right. But we do, because we follow this book right here.
Right.
So we're actually to the letter following this book when it tells us to do something. And when it says nothing about it, we're allowed to keep an older custom for a good reason. On Good Friday, the only, I think, argument you can make that we're doing something perhaps that may touch on an issue of obedience is that we retain the Oremus and the Flectamus Genua for the prayers for the Jews, but we keep the text of Pius XII and not the new text omitting the Perfides of John the 23rd. Again, this book right here.
Okay.
Right? We keep that book rather than crossing out things in that book and changing them because we heard a decree somewhere. But It bears a little mention here, and I'll be very quick about this because I know we're tending to run already quite long. Why was this genuflection added back in? It's not a genuflection. That's why. I think we misunderstand this. We genuflect to the Blessed Sacrament. We genuflect to the cross. We may genuflect in the liturgy to a bishop because he's a symbol of Christ. What are we genuflecting to when somebody says flectamus genua? We're not reverencing anything. It's a penitential gesture, right? And where this comes from, in fact, is from the idea, which is in Good Friday, which is in this book here, where we start by saying, let us pray also for these people and these things and everything like that. And then the priest says, let us pray. And the deacon says, kneel down. And the idea here was that, and the whole purpose of this is that for a short period of time, everyone would offer mentally their own prayer.
Right.
And then everyone together would be told to stand and pray together as one through the priest, who would then offer all of these prayers under his own words to God. And this is actually where we get the whole idea of you ever wonder why the prayer is called a collect prayer?
There we go.
It's the ecclesia collecta, the gathered church who is praying. So this is the idea of the oremus flectamus genua. It's not a genuflection at all. And it's done plenty of times. Ember Wednesday and Saturday, the introductory part is missing now. The preparatory admonitions for ordinations, this is done even now. If you've seen ordinations before, the bishop will say, let us pray, effectively, for these candidates and the various qualities they have, something like that. Let's pray, let's kneel, let's get up. The difficulty is, and the reason we confuse this with a genuflection, is it became so customary to hear oremus flectamus genua lavate, whereas basically we're down as fast as we're up. But in the Roman liturgy, remember, we don't add just random genuflections to things. There's a purpose here. And so if it looks superfluous, we should look for the reason for it. And the reason for this is given us by tradition. It's time for personal prayer. And in fact, the rubricist will talk about how we should kneel down for a short period of time between oremus and flectamus genua and then lavate.
Yeah.
So we should be able to offer this. So what are we doing here? Why is this added back in? It's because there's no good reason to remove it. It's because it was misunderstood as a genuflection. And it was even misunderstood by experts as we don't genuflect because the Jews genuflected towards our Lord in mockery.
But that's not the point.
But
that was never the point. Yeah.
But it never happened.
Yeah, right.
Who genuflects towards our Lord in mockery? The Romans. Right. Because it was a Roman gesture towards a king or an emperor. The Jews didn't genuflect. That wasn't a Jewish gesture. And yet we don't leave it out for the pagans. So this whole confusion over what it was and why it was happening, even Dom Guéranger confuses this, and he's quite an expert. But this was the general idea and the understanding.
Yeah.
But it was a mistaken understanding. And so now we add it back in.
Because we fix it because it's necessary to fix what wasn't broken.
Yes, this is where the Pian Commission was saying, hey, if it's deformed, let's fix it. Yeah. This was a deformed idea about what was going on here, and so it's repaired. That's different, though, than the textual change. And that's one of the reasons we don't accept the textual change. The textual change, the effort to change that only started in the 1920s with Zionism. And it was, in fact, many requests made by even Catholic clerics who were sort of in favor of Zionism. Even Cardinal Mary del Val, of all people, the Secretary of State of Pius X, until he figured out that this was not a good idea, and then he, in fact, objected to it quite loudly. It was even asked by Eugenio Zoli, remember the chief rabbi of Rome, who, thanks to Pius XII's efforts in World War II, converted. Even he had asked Pius XII for it. But the Holy Office had examined the requests beforehand and said, listen, this prayer is very ancient, so we don't want to change it. The liturgical changes, if we're going to change them because private individuals or certain groups, organizations request change, if we start doing this, there's no limiting principle. In fact, perfidies, being a breach of contract or covenant, is exactly what God was accusing the unfaithful Jews of doing. And it was introduced by Pius V. Certainly, he wasn't anti-Jewish. And the Jews who remained faithless actually took responsibility for the crucifixion, not those who converted. And to add to this argument, too, why we keep it, removing it actually makes it much more anti-Jewish.
Yeah.
Because we're praying for Jews without any restriction, rather than those who haven't yet converted. Because many did convert. In fact, most of the apostles were Jews, right? They weren't faithless. They continued into the true religion. The Pharisees and those who follow after them, those were the ones for whom we're praying that the veil will be lifted from their heart. And so if we don't make that distinction, we end up saying something that may not be entirely true or touches on ecclesiology. This begins to touch on doctrine, actually, even if it's just one word. Okay. And in fact, it becomes even more anti-Jewish because now we're not making a distinction. Yep. And those who did convert, in a certain sense, are like second-class Christians who still need a veil lifted from their heart.
Yeah, exactly. And that's really problematic for Catholics to do, Christians to do at all.
Absolutely. And so, in fact, keeping the prayer as it was is far less anti-Jewish and far more accurate as to what we're praying for. But we have to understand it with a Latin understanding of what that word means. It does not mean, treacherous. It means lacking faith. Those who have neglected the covenant that they agreed to, and instead of going into this new covenant that was agreed to, God wanted them to go into, they didn't do that.
Yeah.
So
fascinating.
So there's a lot there, and we could go on for ages.
Oh, we could. And so I guess just to wrap up, to kind of put a bow on it, we used the 1956. I keep saying we. Father, you used the 1956 OHS, that red book that you've been holding up.
The red book I've been holding up, yes.
And it is because that is the last officially published one. The one change that the SSPX essentially does not follow, which is not, the changes that the SSPX makes are allowed, like the knocking on the door and some of those other smaller things. It does not use that perfidious text, or it does use the perfidious text. It doesn't follow the OHS there, but that's because, you just finished saying,
it follows the OHS. It doesn't follow. It doesn't follow a decree that was sort of the John the 23rd without any pretext.
Right.
Pretext for text, right? Without any pretext, decided to change, and ostensibly to when the Holy Office just beforehand had said, not a good idea.
Got it. Wow. We covered a lot in about 2 hours. That's really good.
Well, hopefully people will have to digest this one in chunks, I think. But
yeah, I think so. But I think it's good. It's one of those, when we're talking about planning these episodes, where our point is to try to make these so-called evergreen. Like, you can go and look at them anytime. It's not time sensitive one way or the other. And I hope that it can be seen in that regard. Oh, what did Father say about Holy Thursday? Let's go take a look at that. But there's a great wealth of information here, Father. Thank you. And thank you for admitting your fault, which is that you like the old one. Sorry.
Fair enough. Again, I definitely like the old one in the sense that if it were a choice between the two, I'd pick the older one.
Sure.
That said, I do like the newer times. They make much more sense. I kind of wish, hope beyond hope. I kind of wish that we would have, they would have been a little more sensitive to the changes. But they're what they are, and it's for the church to solve those in the long run. I hope good academic research, debates, various exploration of this, steel manning the other's position, looking through that will later along, when the church does return to her sanity, allow for a great development here, organic development, the keeping of the best of these things, and an authentic look at what maybe is misunderstood, deformed, needing reform, needing to be inserted, needing to be taken away, without the sort of taking one side or the other that oftentimes happens. I'd like the academic side of it, if that's possible.
Yeah. Father, thank you so much for the marathon. Great scholarship as always. I appreciate it. We'll talk to you next time.
All right. God bless.
You too.